Next up is Adam Gazzaley, that I've met a few weeks ago in San Francisco. He is the founding director of the Neuroscience Imaging Center of UCSF. And Adam is working on fascinating connections between the brain and video games. He also has this Oculus mask that he showed me, where you can see your brain in real time. It's absolutely fascinating. I'm delighted to have Adam. Adam Gazzaley, will you join me on stage? Welcome, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great you made it.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. I'm excited to... Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. I'm excited to share with you some of my work that I'm doing at UCSF on video games, neuroscience, and really giving you a vision of the future that we're very excited about. I want to start with the highest level goal, one that I think about all the time, which is how do we improve quality of life? And I could tell you that not all of my scientist colleagues share exactly this goal. There's a lot of attention to allowing us to live longer. And I think it's a bit misdirected if we're only trying to focus on longevity and not quality. And so that's really what I want to talk to you about. How do we improve the quality of life that we have in the time that we're living? One of the ways of approaching that is to improve our cognitive abilities, in both those that are healthy and impaired. And I'm going to present this parallel stream of information, both from the healthy perspective, where I think improving our cognitive abilities is really the foundation of what we should be thinking about when we discuss education, right? It's not just the transfer of content, it's the improving of how our brains process information. And from the impaired perspective, it's really the entire basis of the mental health care system, both psychological and neurological diseases. So where do we stand right now? So what's the current state of the art for improving cognition? Well, let's take this case, and this is a patient as a neurologist that I see quite frequently, a 60-year-old who winds up in his physician's office because he has changes in his attention, his memory abilities, his cognition, enough that he's concerned. Maybe he has a family history of Alzheimer's disease, maybe his spouse is very worried, but in either case, he winds up there. What happens? Well, the first thing that happens is, unfortunately, we get a very poor characterization of what's going on. Even though the world of functional brain imaging has been chugging away in the scientific exploration of the brain for the last 20 years, this person will not get functional brain imaging. We will be unlikely to know exactly what's going on inside their brain that's leading to the behavioral changes that brought them into the doctor's office. But that does not stop us from treating them, right? And this is how we treat them. We give them one of these, right? Now, not to make an entirely global negative statement about the use of drugs in psychiatry and neurology, but I can tell you that we do not have a highly targeted medication to improve cognition. And I mean across the entire range of diseases and the entire range of cognition, not just memory and attention, but also mood regulation for the psychiatric conditions. And so we're going to have a drug that's not precisely targeted to the underlying computational unit of the brain, which is the neural network. Instead, it'll act more generally on a neurotransmitter system. Because of that, we have to increase doses to very high level to get effects, and then we wind up getting side effects, which is probably around 80% of what we do as physicians, is treat the very side effects of the medications that we're giving to have an impact. So that's the second problem. The next problem is that the prescription that a person gets is entirely non-personalized. So it's based on large data sets that really ignore heterogeneity and individual differences. And so even though this prescription is not targeted, it's also not really personalized to this individual's brain. The other problem is that it's almost entirely unimodal. So physicians will also give a single treatment like this, but not pay attention to other things that we know are important for brain health, like physical exercise. So the siloed approach of how we treat is also a big challenge. And the last is that the system is open loop. What does it mean to be open loop? Well, it's easiest for me to describe that by telling you what a closed-loop system is. A closed-loop system is where you intervene in some way, record the impact, and then with as little time as possible, very low latency, you reapply based on that data, and you have a closed feedback loop. And this is the most powerful way to change any system, physical or biological. Our current system is the opposite of that. You take a medication, you go home, you observe subjectively your effects and side effects over several months, then you return to the physician's office and recount that, and then a decision is made that's not empirically based to increase or decrease the medications, and this very open loop process continues again. And I would say that this is just not good enough. This is not where we should be in the state of the art of medicine right now for any of these conditions. I would also say that the same type of issues exist in the world of education. So if we think of a 12-year-old who's high-performing but has a very selective deficit in an aspect of their cognition, like working memory, we are unlikely to have any idea that exists because we don't do detailed cognitive testing unless someone is actually thought to have a learning disability. And our education system is not targeting the underlying basis of how our brain processes information to improve things like selective attention, working memory, and goal management. And so we wind up with a lot of these same problems when we look at the education system that we see in the medical world. So what I want to share with you now, and we wind up with these deficits across both domains. So I want to share with you now an approach that we're working on to have something that's targeted, closed-loop, multimodal, and personalized. Now, if we look at the whole landscape of cognitive enhancement, we see that there are many different avenues that we might impact the brain to improve cognition. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all of these with you now, but they're all potential avenues that we can impact. What I do want to tell you about is some of our work on video games. Now, I know that this audience is probably well familiar with video games. As you probably know, video games have become entirely global and pretty much ubiquitous. They're largely balanced across males and females now, and the average age of a gamer is approaching 37 years old, 40 years old, and that's not just because of young gamers like myself becoming old. It's because games have, and game producers have learned how to target games to different types of populations. So we know it's a powerful multi-billion-dollar industry. But can it have a positive impact? And that's a really important question. I want to pull up a quote that I found from Time magazine in the early days of video games that sort of speaks to at least the earliest views of this. Video games are just another manifestation of human mania, our enduring quality of going relentlessly after absolutely pointless goals. Now, I don't suspect that many people in this audience have that view, but it is a pretty pervasive view about what a lot of people think about when video games come to mind. I was inspired around 6 years ago by a literature that started emerging on these types of video games. So this is a picture of a first-person shooter video game over here. And as you probably are aware, these are very immersive, high-interference environments where you're looking through your own eyes and making decisions about where an enemy is, where a friendly is, and essentially playing in this very high-reward setting. Well, around 2002, 2003, scientific papers started to show that the young adults that play these video games, when you take them into the laboratory and study their cognitive abilities, are off the charts. They're much better than their peers. And if you take naives that have not played these games and have them play on them even for 10 hours, you start seeing some of these same effects. So I challenged my lab if we could develop a customized video game, in our case, taking away the violence, because we didn't think that was an essential active ingredient, to improve cognitive abilities in older adults. And we had been studying aging in older adults for 20 years, so we knew where we wanted to act. We knew where the vulnerabilities were and how their brains process information, and we had functional biomarkers with neuroimaging. Those are the tools that we tend to use. So the question is, can we use the mechanics of video game and take advantage of the immersiveness and the engagement and the plasticity of the brain to see if we can improve how the brain functions? And so I reached out to friends of mine that work in the video game industry. This was at George Lucas's company, LucasArts, and we built this game called NeuroRacer. And essentially what NeuroRacer is a game where you travel on a car into a 3D environment, and you have to both do this driving task at the same time that you do a sign task, where you press as rapidly and accurately for a target sign. And some of the secret special ingredients behind the game was that each of these tasks has an independent adaptive algorithm, meaning that they assess your ability in real time and then scale the challenge of the game to be appropriate to your skills, so that you're always challenged right at the level of your ability. It's never too hard where it's frustrating or too easy where it's boring. We think that this is the way that you harness plasticity. Our game designers would say that this is the way you build a game that has flow. And so we built this game, and then if you tried to play this game now, and so you have the driving task and the sign task, both of which demand a lot of attention, you would tend to trade off and pick one to get good on, even if you did it subconsciously. So we avoid that by coupling across these algorithms with reward cycles. So when you play this game, you never level up unless both of these skills get better. And we have found that everyone, including 80-year-olds, want to level up on video games. It's just a basic, clearly human nature. And so that's how the game works. So now I want to show you just a quick tour of some of the data from this paper. I want to tell you about how we can use a video game as a behavioral diagnostic tool, as a neural diagnostic tool, and then as an intervention to improve how our brain functions. So what you're looking at here is a graph where on the x-axis is decades of life, starting from the 20s and going all the way to 80 years old. And the index on the y-axis is how well you multitask. So the red line means that you multitask perfectly. It means that you do that sign task, pressing the signs rapidly and accurately, as well when you do it alone as when you also drive at the same time. That would be 0%. And so the percentages are how much a cost you suffer by multitasking. So 20-year-olds, all of whom think that they will be absolutely perfect at this task because they believe completely that they're multitasking masters, we find drop 27% on this task when they multitask at the same time. What happens as we get older? Well, we already know that older adults, like 70 and 80-year-olds, do not do very well at this type of multitasking challenge. But what happens in between? Do you just maintain these skills at this high level and then plummet one horrible day when you're 69 years old? That's not what happens. This is what happens. You actually plummet a little bit every day. So we see that this type of skill declines across the lifespan in a rather linear pattern. As a matter of fact, the biggest difference between two adjacent decades of life are between 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds. And if you look at 8 to 12-year-olds, they're around the age of around 40. So this is a skill that improves to peak. So if you're at 23 right now in this audience, you should be pretty happy with yourself. This is probably the peak of your pyramid right now. And then it sort of levels off throughout lifespan. We also had a challenge for our game designers. Can we build a game that did not just act as a diagnostic and a therapeutic, but that we could record neural activity during gameplay, both with EEG and functional MRI? So I'm going to show you some of the EEG data that we recorded during gameplay. So this is one of our participants wearing a high-density 64-channel wired EEG cap over there. And the measure that we're interested in is something known as midline frontal theta. And what that is, it's a blast of activity in a low frequency range from the front part of your brain, the most evolved part of your brain that's involved in a demanding task like this. And what we're interested in is how this part of your brain responds at the most challenging moment in the game, when you're driving the car and a sign comes up. So we lock all of the signals from your brain to that very second, to that moment when the sign comes up, and then look at what happens in your brain over the course of that second. So let's take a look at the brains of 20-year-olds. So you're looking at something called a surface topography from EEG data. And the nose is pointing up, the ears are pointing to the side, and there's a power spectrum over here on your left. And you could see red, the warm color, is the highest activity, blue is the lowest. And you could see if you look at the head, there's a burst of activity. This occurs a third of a second after a sign comes up while also driving. You could see it's in the yellow range. So we know this peaks around 300 milliseconds in and then decays over the course of a second, right after you did this really challenging multitasking demand. Let's take a look at the brain of our older adults. And this is what we see. So there's a peak there, right? It's sort of green level, so it's not quite above the halfway point. So we can see, using the game, both a decrement in the behavior in a very sensitive way, and also the neurological engagement of the brain during the gameplay. Now let's look at how the game acts as an intervention to improve these abilities. So we did a study. This was actually a collaboration with Apple at the time. We distributed laptops around the Bay Area to older adults, and we had them play the game. One group played it in the multitasking mode, so driving and the sign task at the same time. And they played it at home for a month, 1 hour a day, 3 days a week for 4 weeks, a total of 12 hours. We had all the data go into Dropbox and then right down to our lab so we can actually monitor their compliance and see them playing while we're in lab and they're at home. Then we brought them back to the lab. We did recordings again and looked to see what happened in their performance on the game and multitasking and what happened in terms of how their brain was engaged. And so let me just show you that piece of data now. So this is what we found. We found that their ability to multitask, which is incredibly challenging for this population, even after 12 hours, exceed that of 20-year-olds on a single gameplay. And what's even more interesting is taking a look at their brain activity. You could see that red peak right there. So we have this really high-level engagement of the prefrontal cortex, and it didn't just reach a higher level. It occurred earlier and had a different, wider distribution. So we see this really beautiful example of functional plasticity in the aging brain that we were able to harness using this type of video game mechanics. We also show that if we brought these older adults back so these are the 60 to 80-year-olds playing the game, if we brought them back 6 months later, we take the game away, many are not unhappy that that occurs, and then we bring them back and we look at them again, we find that their skills in multitasking on the game have not even declined significantly, which was actually surprising to us. We're now following that up to understand a little bit more of why that is. Let me tell you another piece of data that we found in this paper. We found that when we studied other cognitive abilities that we did not directly train with the game, which is sort of the holy grail in our field, this transfer of abilities from what you train on to what you benefit, we find improvements in working memory for faces, which is very different than what happened in the gameplay, holding a face in mind for 7 seconds and then accurately identifying it, even in the setting of interference, and attention span, this really boring task in this impoverished environment where you have to hold your attention to a rare target. We find that these skills improve only in the group that plays the game in the multitasking version. We have another group play the game, same game, but they play single task. They do drive, sign. They never do them at the same time. They don't show any improvement in their ability to multitask. They show none of the brain changes, and they show no improvements on these other tasks. So it was challenging of their brains in this high interference environment, similar to what we see in first-person shooter games, in a closed-loop fashion where we're using the data about their performance to drive the game dynamics to challenge them appropriately. There is where the closed loop comes in. We're able to improve these abilities. We also show that it's actually the change in the brain that's related to it. So if we take a look at each of the participants, we see that some have bigger changes from before to after than others. If we do a correlation between the change in brain activity from before to after, we find that it correlates with the transfer of benefits to the other task. So those that show the biggest change in their brain on the video game show the most improvement on the untrained task, and they also show the most sustained benefits in multitasking 6 months later. So this is how we start building up the design principles of how we create a game to challenge the brain appropriately and understand what is the mechanism that leads to a change that can transfer to other skills. And we were fortunate that this was published in Nature. It was the cover of Nature in September last year, which to a scientist is like, being on the cover of Rolling Stone to a musician. And for us, it was very gratifying. That was a 5-year study that I just described to you. And you could see we had this exciting, intimidating title that Nature put on the journal, this pun of game changer, which is certainly a good one for us. But it actually led to quite a challenge for me to have to message to the media for months, including even up until recently, that I don't actually view this game as the game changer. I mean, I love the game. I built the game, we tested it, we're very excited with the results. But if there is a game changer here, I hope what it is that we can work with professionals in the video game industry to build a customized game that targets a known deficit in a given population, and then do a carefully controlled study with neural measures to understand the mechanism, and start building a pool of validation that the scientific community trusts, and start thinking about these type of tools as true diagnostic and therapeutics. And so what happens now? Well, we've been asked thousands of times to have this game distributed, right? People say, oh, I want to play that game. I'm older, my memory is changing. Unfortunately, the game is not a product, it's an experiment, right? It's on an operating system that's out of date. We don't have tech support in our laboratory. So in order to do that, we have to bridge between academics and industry. And to do that, I helped co-found a company called Achille Interactive Labs. I keep my day job as a professor and really serve just as an advisor for this company, and filed the patent behind the methodology that drives that game. And so now Achille is building a game that's much better from a game point of view. So all of those folks from LucasArts that worked on the original game now came over. They helped build this. So I'm going to show you a video of what a game looks like when it can leave a lab, and then talk over it a bit and tell you what's going on under the hood. So the idea is to maintain all of the same mechanics of the video game, the challenges across 2 tasks, but to keep the violent content out of it, because we don't think that's required, but to bring on high levels of art, music, and story to maintain engagement and immersion. So this is now an iPad game, much more accessible and scalable than what we had before. It uses the accelerometer, which is a way more intuitive way, especially for older adults and younger children to play. And you move through these tasks. You have the sign task where you tap on the screen. You have the driving, navigating task. And the same goals of improving both tasks until you get the reward. But because we now have a dedicated game design team, we can build many different challenges, not like NeuroRacer where it's just one challenge that got harder. You can move through different environments where you could see here the navigation gets more difficult, the perceptual tasks get more difficult. We can bring on memory demands. If we ask 8 to 12-year-olds, all they want to do is customize their avatar. It's the only feedback we get from that age group, so we could do that. Helps them to be involved in the game and bring on different environments which just create a more enduring experience where we can look at this as a therapeutic. So that's what the game looks like now. So then I have the frustrating role that I can't tell people that want the game that they can have that game because the company made this interesting decision not to push the game out as a consumer product, but rather to go through a full set of validation studies across conditions like ADHD, depression, traumatic brain injury, Alzheimer's disease, and autism to see if they can validate the game through a US FDA pathway as a therapeutic tool or a diagnostic tool, depending on the condition. So these studies have already begun. They're multi-center trials, just like you would do for a drug or a device. And we'll know, hopefully, within a year even for some of these, whether or not they reach that level of validation in terms of impact and side effects, because it's not certainly unreasonable that these games might not have side effects as well, like addiction, which also has to be viewed. So that's what's going on now. While that's happening, now that that game has left my lab, we're left sort of with an empty nest, right? We need new tools, and now that we're sort of empowered by our success with that game, to see if we can take technology, and not just video game technology, but other technology, many of it which is sitting in the consumer domain, and build that in as new tools. So we created this new lab at UCSF. I'll give you a quick snapshot of it because I think you'll find it interesting given your background. So this is what our lab looks like, not a classic neuroscience lab, but this is the control room, which is sitting on the opposite side of our experimental room. So this, to us, is a neurophysiology lab. We could record pretty much everything in this lab, from real-time brain imaging to eye movements, to body movements, to heart rate variability, to galvanic skin response, all at the same time that we present really immersive, interactive experiences to our participants to try to take what we've already done to the next level. Just want to give you a snapshot of some of the new technology we're excited about. Obviously, mobile and wireless is without a doubt interesting to us because of its scalability, not just in terms of tablets and phones, but wireless EEG technology like you see here. We can get our recording instruments out into people's homes and use it in a much more usable way. Virtual reality, a relationship with Oculus as well as Sony now, as well as motion capture here using the Kinect, are also tools that we're very interested in. And it's probably easiest for me to tell you what we're doing with this, just to give you a quick snapshot of 4 of the games that we have developing in our lab right now. Now remember, these are not products, they're experiments that we're building that will hopefully show that they have an impact. We'll publish it, and then they'll leave the lab. So let me just show you a couple of them. This is a game called Body Brain Trainer, or BBT, and the goal of this game is to integrate both physical and cognitive demands into one platform so that the player is engaged in something that's challenging their brain. You could see an example of it here, and challenging their cognitive abilities at exactly the same time. So while the player this is a perceptual task and a task switching demand, quite challenging. The adaptive algorithm is pushing them to the level of their ability, but they're also wearing a heart rate monitor. You could see in the upper left-hand corner at 117 over there. And so while they're playing, their heart rate is being recorded, and we're moving the stimuli around so that they have to do either larger or smaller movements so that we could hold their heart rate at exactly the level that we want to target them physically. So that's one game to see if there's a benefit of training your brain in an embodied way, that you'll have more of an impact on performance. This is a game known as Rhythmicity. It's a collaboration with many musicians, including Mickey Hart from the Grateful Dead and Rob Garza from Thievery Corporation. And in this game, we're taking advantage of the fact that we already know that our brain is a rhythmic machine, that higher order abilities, like I showed you from the Nature paper, depends on these rhythms in the brain and synchrony across brain regions. We know that many cultures have used rhythm therapeutically for thousands of years. Can we carefully validate that rhythm improves how our brain functions using a video game engine to drive it? And so again, similar to the last experiment, we've created a game that pushes on our ability to synchronize, syncopate, engage with rhythms, and then see what its impact is. We have a virtual attention game. This game is the earliest, so I'll go through it quickly, but essentially to put you in a large three-dimensional structure and challenge you not to focus your attention, but distribute your attention more broadly, a skill that we use, such as when we drive, that we know declines with aging. And the last game I want to tell you about is a game we call MetaTrain. MetaTrain is a game that I designed that takes the principles of concentrative meditation, focusing on your breath, resisting external distraction, holding internal attention, and integrates it with the game dynamics of adaptivity and feedback. And this is an interesting collaboration between our lab, a meditation guru known as Jack Kornfield, and a game developer, Zynga, who's built the game really as a philanthropic venture for us. So this is an iPad game, was just completed. I've actually been playing it all week in our beta testing. And again, it is designed to help you self-regulate internal distraction using the same type of video game principles. So what we have here are 4 games that are just about completed. We've been working on these for around 18 months now, which is sort of an out-of-body experience for our lab since we're really research scientists. But we know that in order to push the envelope in this domain, we need new tools. So we have these 4 games. Starting in January, these become research experiments to understand how we can harness plasticity using all of the mechanics and the underlying principles behind these activities, which many already engage in their daily lives. So why build it as a game? Because the game acts as a delivery system, a vehicle where we can do something in a reproducible way across many individuals, study it carefully, and make it accessible to people where some of these activities are not. But I think the real win is not going to happen in the next year when we study all these games. The real win is going to happen in 5 years or 6 years from now when we start looking at how all of these interact with each other. Something that I call Neuro Crossfit training, right? If you could train across all these domains, how will they interact and give synergistic effects? Now, I said it's going to be a while until we study that formally, but this seems like a sort of harmful self-experimentation period. So in January, I begin engaging in all these games at the same time in my lab. And, you know, I really don't know what's going to happen, but I have some pretty high-level expectations of this. So we'll see what happens over the next year. Okay, I want to conclude in our short remaining time with the most sort of far forward-thinking part of our laboratory. And that's that the video games are really just a tool, an engine to engage the brain in a selective way, to harness plasticity. But we think that that is just the beginning. All those games I showed you is really where we begin. We want to use tools like neuromodulation and neurofeedback to then enhance those effects. How do we do that? Well, first we need a way to record what's going on in the brain with as high fidelity as possible during an engagement in a video game like we described. So this is a tool, if you look it up, it's called the Glass Brain. We've been developing this in our laboratory in collaboration with the Sports Center at UCSD. This is an MRI image from someone in our lab. So the structural part of the cortex you could see around the surface, the DTI, which is a sequence that captures the fibers, these golden fibers that connect the different brain areas. And then what you're looking at in the colors are different rhythms that are overlaid on top using wireless 64-channel EEG. We worked with NVIDIA and CUDA programming to try to get as real-time processing as possible. So all of this is occurring within 200 milliseconds. We're rejecting artifacts. We're source localizing based on the MRI data. And we're doing a process called Granger causality to understand and create predictive models of how information flows between different brain areas. We take all of this data and we bring it into Unity Game Engine, where we develop all of our games. And we get this really beautiful way of just exploring a brain that's functioning in real time. Now, this is still really a proof of concept here. We have not harnessed this machine yet and used it in our experiments. That's what we're doing now. But we are really excited about this multi-center collaboration to try to have a tool to see what's happening in the brain in real time. So what do we do with this once we have this? Well, one thing that we could do is look at how we might benefit from real-time diagnostics, looking at how the brain is engaging in real time. And I pulled this image mostly for fun. This is Mickey Hart, who's the drummer from the Grateful Dead, and he's wearing an Oculus Rift. He's playing an early version of rhythmicity called Neurodrummer in virtual reality. You could see over there. Sitting next to him is Tim Mullen, who's a scientist, one of our head engineers in this project from UCSD. He's wearing an Oculus Rift, but he's flying inside Mickey's brain in virtual reality. So Mickey's also wearing a 64-channel wireless EEG cap at the same time. So what we really have here is sort of what I think of as like a neuro-nested doll. So Mickey is inside virtual reality playing a drumming game, and Tim is inside Mickey's brain while Mickey engages in the game. So maybe this could be, you know, your therapist one day flying inside your brain while you are challenged in an appropriate way. But what we're most excited about is closing the loop. So first I want to point out that we already use closed loop mechanics, right? I mentioned that with our video games. You're playing the game, something happens in your brain, it changes your behavior. The game detects that in real time, adjusts the challenge and the feedback to give you a different environment to challenge you appropriately in a closed loop. But if we had a glass brain, we could record brain activity, feed that data into the game engine. So essentially, the game would be diagnosing the weaknesses in how your brain processes information in real time, and then uses that data to guide the gameplay, to target the improvement in processes like a gamma knife. We also want to use the neural activity to guide brain stimulation. So we have several experiments in our lab using stimulators, transcranially, alternating current and direct current stimulation, especially alternating current, to use the brain data to then put pressure on the brain in a certain way to help push the plasticity. And so what we wind up here is this is where we sit now in 2014. I'll conclude with this slide, where drugs are really acting as a blunt instrument. We just don't have the specificity yet to target the circuits in the brain. But what I hope is that even by 2019, we'll be able to decrease doses, thus decreasing side effects, and then use targeted custom-designed video games to activate circuits in the brain, use EEG data related to the weak processing steps, feed that into the game to potentiate those deficient circuits, take other neural signals, feed them into a stimulator when necessary. Maybe this is if you have a traumatic brain injury and really need to push basic plasticity in that region. And what we wind up here is something that's targeted, personalized, not just personalized, but to the individual as they change over time. Multimodal, acting across many different domains, and multiple closed loops going at the same time. We've already started these type of relationships, and this is what we hope to see over the next 10 years, is how this type of technology that really harnesses all of the innovation that we see in the tech world that you're so familiar with and bring it into this domain. So this is not a theoretical list. All of these relationships with my colleagues that study these conditions or have patients with these conditions have already begun. So not necessarily to cure these diseases or change the pathology, but to strengthen our brains so that we have an invading force, we have a stronger brain in order to resist the negative functional consequences of that. And then, of course, there's a really exciting interest in thinking about this as an educational tool as well. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.